On the 15th of March 2026, I released my first AI-made game, and it failed. Not in the sense that I'm embarrassed by it, or that I think it was a terrible game, or that I even regret making it, but in the simple sense that I spent over 700 hours making Scarred Steel, and at the time of recording, I think this pretty much had about 30 sales. So, it's not exactly life-changing, but I think it's worth talking about properly because when people talk about making games with AI, especially online, it can sometimes sound like this magical thing where when you have an idea, you type a few prompts and suddenly you have a game which loads of people care about and a game which was made immediately. But my experience with Scarred Steel wasn't really like that. It was messy, it was stressful, and it took way longer than I expected, and there were way too many moving parts. And honestly, even though AI helped me massively, I also made the project much harder than it needed to be. So this video is basically me looking back at Scarred Steel as my first project, what went wrong, what I learned, and why I still don't think it was a waste of time. Because it definitely failed in some ways, but it also proved something to me. It proved that I could actually finish a game, and that alone is probably worth more than the sales. Scarred Steel started pretty much with a simple idea. I played a game called Heads Will Roll Reforged, and I really enjoyed it. And I like the idea of this medieval sort of, story-rich game, and I wanted to do something similar. I thought, well, if I could make something, with like that with AI, that would be ideal. At the time, I was sort of in my sort of B2B business and was honestly looking for a way out. So I figured we'd give it a try. And at the time, it did feel really exciting because, with AI, I honestly, like without AI, I probably wouldn't have even tried it to begin with. But with AI, I actually felt like I could build it. And so I started, and I honestly started in the most painful way possible. But the first 300 hours of the project, which reached me to making and releasing the demo, I was basically using ChatGPT, pretty much copy and pasting code back and forth. I'd ask for a script or I'd give it an idea, it would give me a script, I'd paste it into Unity, and a lot of the time something would break. Or down the line, something would break. And I copied the error messages into ChatGPT, it would give me a fix. Something else would break, and sometimes I'd be copying 4 to 5 different scripts into the chat and trying to figure out what was going wrong and what we needed to change. And that process, I'm really surprised I stuck with for that long that I did, because the process was exhausting. It did work, to be fair. It was able to get a few things working, but it was very, very messy. And really the main issue was that with that ChatGPT really couldn't see the whole project. And, in the end, it just made things very, very difficult. Now, the good news is that from there, I did then discover Cursor AI, which made things a lot easier because Cursor AI pretty much connects to your project and you give it prompts and it goes and makes, edits, and deletes scripts if you ask it to. Basically, it does a very good job at being able to pretty much outsource all of the coding that you sort of needed. And so that really did help the game or help things speed up and actually get the outcome of eventually releasing the game. Now, in the end, I think one of the issues that I struggled, or at least why the game failed, is when it came to the images and the story. Now, I don't think they were inherently awful, but they definitely could have been a lot better. For reference, I decided that it would be a great idea to make a story-rich game that would based off lots of cutscenes and images. Because I thought, well, if AI can make images, then maybe this is the way to go about doing it. In the end, I massively underestimated how much work that would become. By the end of the project, I had about 523 images that were just cutscenes and background alone. And that only accounts for the images that made it into the game. That does not account for the hundreds more of images that did not make the cut. The failed generations, the one where the main character looked wrong, or the ones where I simply changed the art style. And I must have spent months just making, sorting, and replacing and simply redoing images. And that was probably the most exhausting part of it, because when you're making a story-rich game with AI, the hardest part isn't necessarily making a good image. It's making hundreds of images that feel like the same game, but also getting the same main character, the same face of him, the same look, the same armor. And that was really quite challenging. And sometimes when I'd be making images, it would make me an image that would look slightly better than the rest, and I think, damn, I want this art style, and so I'd then look to redo them. And that was fine in the moment, but honestly, over time, it really became quite a bit of a nightmare. And just, adding more and more didn't really help. And the issue was really is that I was focused so much more on the look of the game rather than the feel of the game, rather than the actual core gameplay loop. And that's where I feel like Scarred Steel has been lacking a little bit. And I feel like I also added a lot of things that I didn't necessarily need. And this is the thing with AI and the sort of the trap with it, because even though it allowed you to iterate far quicker and easier, it also can be very tempting to start making lots of things that you don't really need. Adding new features, adding more bits of story, adding more systems, when in reality you don't really need it. Although it gives you, or although AI gives you the leverage, you don't really need to be focusing on making all sorts of things, because that just takes you down a whole new rabbit hole, when in reality you should be asking the questions of why is the game fun, what keeps them playing, what is the smallest version of this game that still works, and just those questions like that. And sometimes like when it came to the scope of the project, I had like for cutscenes, I had like one image every 3 to 4 like text slides, which was way too many images for the actual cutscene itself. And one of the worst parts was that around 5 days before I was actually meant to release the full game, I still hadn't managed to reach the end of the game myself through playtesting, which is not ideal. That's probably the position you do not want to be in 5 days before release, but that is simply where I was. I was still trying to fix bugs. I was, well, probably, honestly, I was still trying to add things to the game without having actually finished the damn thing. And that was not great. Right, and like I know, like before I released the demo, there were nights where I was up until like 2:30 in the morning trying to fix whatever I could before actually being able to release the game. And I'm sure plenty of developers have had stressful moments before the release, but for me, honestly, I built up so much stress because I was just faffing around with so many things I didn't really need to do. So that's pretty much that. And, I'm glad the people who played it and reviewed it had a good experience, or at least, went and sort of supported me with that. I know I had a few friends which sort of played and supported it, which was nice. Now, the Steam Fest did actually really help. I did apply for the Steam Fest for the game, and that really massively helped. And moving forward for my projects like Primus and even sort of the Roblox stuff, I'm obviously going to be taking those considerations into mind. For Primus, for example, I've also applied for the upcoming Steam Fest for that. So it's very, very useful because the Steam Fest for Scarred Steel did actually allow me to get quite a few wish lists and even get the game getting more traction. And obviously, ideally, the plan is that I can continue to build my YouTube so that I can drive more traffic to what I'm doing and hopefully at least be able to get a bit more feedback in terms of the games that I'm making. So that's about that. But overall, honestly speaking, I think just, when it comes to my game, sure, it sort of, I guess, failed. You could even make the argument that, well, you know what, because it's the first game, it's probably not really going to go anywhere. But I always like to try and be a bit reflective of what I'm doing. Obviously, you'll have people that'll say, well, because you used AI, it didn't do well, which is fair enough, right? But I did have at least a few people leave a positive review. So, someone liked it at least. So we're going to be moving forward from that. But I think generally, when it comes down to just, making games, or at least what I'm finding, right, and I'm not successful by any means, I think what I'm finding is that it's coming down a lot more to the core gameplay loop. How does the game feel, and less about what it looks like. Because, there are games which don't look visually incredible. You've got, like sort of pixel art games like, Terraria, for example, which, I mean, it's not, like massively improved quality, but the core gameplay loop is there, right? It's very, very good. I mean, I don't play it, I never have, but it's got very, very good reviews, etc. And so it's stuff like that where it's like it's looking at games and going, right, well, they've done something which just works. And so that's the thing with AI, where I think at least I'm finding for my current projects, it's trying to focus less on how things look and more about how things feel. But that's pretty much where I'm at with it, and I'll catch you soon.